In this final lecture, I'm going to at last bring us up into the 21st century and discuss how the internet is reshaping the ways that news is produced and consumed. I'll also talk about how the balance of cultural power is shifting, how we might have to rethink our answer to the questions that guided my very first lecture in this series. The questions: who controls the media and how? Of course, the internet hasn't changed everything. I don't want to overstate the effect of the shift to online communication. A lot of what I've covered from the 20th century, even the 19th century, still holds up as far as, the way propaganda works, how people make sense of the world, the effect of media ownership and government policies on news production. We don't need to completely reinvent the wheel when thinking about the internet. And anyway, older forms of news media still do exist, and a lot of people all around the world still get their news mainly from TV, radio, or newspapers. Although, of course, the way that so-called traditional news media operate has changed pretty dramatically over the past couple of decades. I'm going to get into how professional journalists' jobs have changed in recent years in the second part of this lecture. But actually right now I want to focus on the big picture, or the even bigger picture, of how the internet has changed the way that information circulates and how the internet has changed the balance of power among various gatekeepers, among various sellers in the market for loyalties. And to begin, I want to remind you briefly of my lecture on Monroe Price and his concept of the market for loyalties, which I think provides a really useful way to think about these recent changes in the world, even though Price came up with those ideas well before the internet became a significant medium. So if you remember, Price's argument was that the market for loyalties, for attention really, isn't just naturally free and democratic and open. Instead, what we see is different factions, different sellers of loyalties, as he put it, engaging in kind of a constant shifting struggle to give themselves the biggest advantage over their competitors. And they do this by making the market, the communications market, whether it's the regulations on satellite TV or subsidies for newsprint, or nowadays laws governing social media platforms. What sellers in the market do is they try to gain a competitive advantage over their rivals by making the market free in some ways while regulating in other ways to serve their benefit. And Price argued that we often see kind of coalitions or different cartels of various political and economic actors forming these kind of temporary uneasy alliances to control the market for loyalties, to push out competitors, or to avoid regulations that could threaten their market dominance. So keep that in mind as I move on to discuss the kind of winners and losers in the new media economy and the ways in which regulations, or lack thereof, have helped some players in the games and hurt others. And it's particularly worth thinking about kind of the new and shifting alliances that could be forming among different businesses, different state actors, different political factions. I'm going to begin with some arguments from Clay Shirky's book, Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. Shirky published Here Comes Everybody in 2008, so relatively early in what was called back then the Web 2.0 revolution, meaning the change from web pages that visitors would just read or watch or listen to, the shift away from that model of relatively passive consumption to interactive, participatory social media. As a reminder, Facebook was founded in 2004. When I created an account in 2005, you still had to have a .edu email address from one of a limited number of universities even to sign up. It hadn't yet kind of taken over the world. And you see that if you read Shirky's book. Facebook is actually just kind of one of a bunch of different social media platforms he talks about. YouTube and Reddit were launched just 3 years, I guess, before the book was published in 2005. Twitter was launched in 2006. Instagram, Snapchat, Twitch, and Vine didn't even exist yet when Shirky wrote his book. So Clay Shirky was weighing in pretty early on the way that the internet was beginning to transform the way we communicate and how it was disrupting established 20th century patterns for how journalism worked and how broadcasting information to audiences worked. He distinguished actually between what he called broadcast media and communications media. So broadcast media are what we've been discussing throughout most of this lecture and talking about mass media like television or newspapers. The idea here is that a single transmitter broadcasts messages to a large number of receivers. It's a one-to-many mode of transmission of information. Communication media, on the other hand, are things like telephones and the postal service. There are many transmitters, many speakers or senders of information who transmit to many different receivers who are themselves able to transmit. So actually in communications media, all participants are transceivers, right? They're able to both send and receive information. That's what communication media is, as opposed to broadcast, where I can yell at my TV, but nobody's getting that message, right? Broadcast media is one-to-many and not many-to-many. But Shirky says that actually this line between broadcast and communication media isn't as clear as it used to be. It used to be much clearer, right? The telephone was private, television was public. There might be certain crossovers, for example, the classified section of a newspaper where ordinary people could pay a bit of money to place an ad, or for example, a book that's broadcast out, but that consists of an author's correspondences, the letters that they exchanged with friends. So there was, maybe sometimes ways for ordinary people to reach the masses, or for what was private communications media messages to reach, to become broadcast. But for the most part, it was pretty clear which forms of media were private and which were public. There's also a clear line between producers and consumers when it came to broadcast media, right? Journalists were professionals being paid to produce content for broadcast media, and most people were consumers. They weren't transceivers. They weren't simultaneously consumers and producers. But the internet, and especially social media, have dramatically blurred the line between broadcast media and communications media. You don't have to own a printing press, you don't have to own a satellite uplink truck in order to engage in one-to-many communications. You might be an ordinary person whose tweet or TikTok video or whatever goes viral, and you meet millions of people. And people also now use chat forums and Twitter and Instagram to have conversations with one another that would have in the past been more private, like private telephone conversations, but are now visible to the public, also visible to state surveillance and other kinds of surveillance. So there's this blurring of the line between public and private media. You also have the rise of citizen journalism, with news getting produced first in the early 2000s, especially by bloggers, which Shirky discusses at length in his book, but now really by pretty much anyone who has a phone and manages to gather an audience, maybe just for a moment, because they've captured a crime on video, or maybe in the longer term as an influencer, or as kind of a semi-professional journalist who isn't employed by any established news organization, but who's able to make a living from social media ad revenue, or from subscriptions through websites like Patreon or Substack that have been popping up in recent years. So what the internet and other digital technologies have allowed, Shirky says, is the mass amateurization of media production. Previously, the ability to produce and widely distribute messages and images, that is the means of mental production, as Marx would have put it, was more centralized and also much more expensive. So the means of mental production were scarce resources. Ink and paper for print media, audio and video equipment, even the electromagnetic frequencies for broadcasting radio and TV signals. These were all scarce resources that you needed a lot of money and probably organization to harness and to use for broadcasting. In that environment of scarcity, a profession formed, the profession of journalism, which acted as a gatekeeper, determining what information got broadcast and filtered out the rest. And these gatekeeping decisions depended on expert judgment, on professional routines, kind of all the previous stuff that I've talked about when discussing gatekeeping theory and discussing the journalistic process. Shirky calls this a filter then publish model. So information first gets heavily filtered through gatekeeping, right, usually in a private setting like a news office, and only then is some of that information that finally makes the cut published for many to see. This model, of course, gives these professional journalists gatekeepers who really, and especially really a pretty small number of editors and owners of media organizations in each country. It gives these gatekeepers really a ton of power to set the agenda for the national conversation, to determine what people are going to pay attention to. But over the past 2 decades or so, we've seen a rapid shift away from the filter then publish model toward a publish then filter model. Now, instead of one-to-many broadcast capabilities being reserved just for the professionals and for well-resourced organizations, now any amateur working alone can publish. The scarce resource now is not the means of mental production, but audience attention itself. So again, if we think back, for much of the 20th century, there were just 3 commercial broadcast TV networks, the big 3, ABC, NBC, and CBS. If you wanted to learn what was going on in the world, at least if you wanted to learn that in the evening while you ate your TV dinner, those were pretty much your options. So a media producer really just had to worry about getting their news story or their advertisement, whatever content they produced, they just had to worry about getting that onto the air on one of those networks. The audience was already kind of there for the taking, and the audience didn't have too many alternatives. But now the options are almost limitless for us, right? As consumers, there's so much content at our fingertips at every moment. We have way more choice in what we can pay attention to and what we can ignore. So where the filtering occurs in the publish then filter model that Shirky describes is not behind the scenes among a small group of professional gatekeepers, but out in the open. It occurs in the competition to attract attention. That's where filtering happens. The content that doesn't attract attention, that doesn't get shared and liked, is effectively filtered, kind of filtered into irrelevance, filtered by all the other content it gets buried under. And by the way, talking about competition for attention is really just another way, it's kind of a rephrasing, a new set of vocabulary for talking about the market for loyalties. Clay Shirky, back in 2008, was cautiously optimistic for the democratizing potential of this publish and filter media ecosystem. He thought it could create a more equitable and fair market for loyalties. More voices could get published, more people who were not part of the elite, people whom professional journalists had paid insufficient attention to historically, could be heard, right? They could be heard because they could publish content, and if it attracted enough popular attention, it could become news, and potentially it could even challenge dominant narratives. And that could happen regardless of what the elite thought, what elite gatekeepers thought, and it could happen for information that the elite would rather maybe sweep under the rug. But since then, since the early 2000s, more recent scholars studying online communication have, I think, become a bit more pessimistic and have argued that bottlenecks in information flows and gatekeepers still very much do exist, not only in traditional media that are still influential, but also on social media platforms. In fact, platforms themselves are becoming centrally important gatekeepers. But unlike the old filter then publish gatekeepers who chose what would be published and what would not, social media companies let their users publish on their platforms whatever they want, but then gatekeep in affecting the visibility of that user-generated content. So it's a kind of publish then filter version of centralized gatekeeping. Sometimes that gatekeeping is more easily recognizable, as when, for example, platforms moderate content by removing it outright or putting up some kind of a disclaimer that a claim's been debunked or that something's not suitable for children. So that can look a little bit more kind of recognizably like censorship or like professionals exercising their judgment. That can look a little bit more like traditional gatekeeping. But other forms of social media platform gatekeeping can be very nearly or entirely invisible to ordinary users, and really very difficult even for people who study this stuff to detect without a lot of difficulty. These social media companies use sophisticated algorithms to automatically promote some content and rank it as relevant to other users, so it appears high up in their news feeds. These algorithms make some stuff appear in search results, but not other content, which essentially filters out some information while helping other information go viral. And there are lots of subtle factors, like even the terms of service of different platforms, which can affect who's able to publish, or perhaps who's able to publish safely online. And this can similarly change kind of the topography of the playing field, if you like, in this competition for attention. It can create an unlevel playing field in the market for loyalties in ways that advantage some media producers over others. I'll talk first a bit about content moderation, drawing on Tarleton Gillespie's 2018 book, Custodians of the Internet. The first thing that Gillespie wants to do is kind of dismiss the myth. The myth which platforms themselves perpetuate for ideological reasons and also as a major selling point, the myth that social media can ever or should ever be completely free and open, right? This space where anybody can express whatever views they like and where the best ideas will rise to the top, right? This idealized marketplace for ideas. There's this powerful myth of internet freedom, but Gillespie says, look, in the real world, whenever a company starts a forum or a platform that hosts user-generated content, whether it's a chat room or a dating app or a photo sharing site or a search engine, if they try to make it truly free and unrestricted, it's not going to be long before they're completely flooded with porn and animal torture and death threats and other horrible stuff that just drives away kind of everybody except the worst people in the world. And that if that happens, that's a disaster for platforms, social media platforms, because their business model, right, is the attention merchant model, which I talked about when discussing Tim Wu's book by that title. Right, their business model is to gather, to aggregate the largest possible crowd, largest possible audience, and then resell that audience's attention to advertisers. And also resell data about that audience's use of their platforms, generally also to advertisers to help, micro-target ads and stuff like this. And the most successful companies like Facebook and Google have really come to dominate the digital ad market by practically monopolizing access to a broad global audience. I mean, a few platforms here and there have kind of found success in this quote-unquote free speech zone, which usually means like catering to niche audiences of horrible people, but usually they also even end up moderating content in some ways in order to avoid getting shut down or getting prosecuted for breaking the law. When it comes to content moderation, American laws are disproportionately important, not just for the US, but actually for the whole world. And that's because so many of the biggest tech companies and platforms are based in the US. So it's worth talking about American law a little bit. Other countries' laws and policies do matter, right? I mean, American companies do come under pressure from other governments, from the governments of other countries, which have especially large user bases. And those countries can, for example, threaten to block their websites and starve them of users, right? There have been various controversies over the way that, for example, Google has handled requests from China to keep pro-democracy web pages off of their search results, the way that Twitter has handled requests from the Turkish government to take down tweets and accounts that the government claims are supporting terrorism, which often just means being anti-government or pro-Kurdish. So there are these kind of cases where other governments are trying to pressure social media to following their own laws, whether those are things that, you know, the social media platforms founders agree with or not. Also, right there are local or other international social media alternatives to the US platforms that are based in other countries. Like in China, for example, right? In China, people use WeChat rather than Facebook and WhatsApp. They use Weibo rather than Twitter. They use Baidu rather than Google. And relations between social media platforms and the state do look very different in China, both in terms of what companies can get held liable for in terms of user-generated content, what they get held liable for, both, you know, officially and unofficially, like in practice. And things look very different in terms of like the level of privacy for social media users in China, which is basically none, right? To use most social media in China, you actually have to link your account to your national ID, and even private direct messages are heavily surveilled, and that's well understood. And then as far as, you know, content moderation regulations go, laws are getting passed in other regions that impose requirements on any social media companies operating in those territories, even if they're US based. So for example, the European Union has passed a law protecting EU citizens' right to be forgotten, quote unquote, right to be forgotten, by social media platforms and other websites. I'll add a animated video about that I directed down in the description. But basically, the right to be forgotten has changed things especially for Google, because now there are cases in which Google will have to delist certain results from searches of a person's name if a court in the EU passes a ruling requiring Google to do so, but, you know, under the argument that having that results appear under Google search results would harm that person, maybe because the first result to pop up is something embarrassing from their past that isn't necessarily relevant, but could, you know, hurt them in trying to get a job or something like that. Anyway, so laws in other countries do certainly matter, but I do want to go into a bit more depth into kind of the quirks of American telecommunications law and how those quirks shape content moderation. Because for so much of the world, it actually is still American countries that are by far the most used, and those US-based companies are most vulnerable, right? Most likely to get into serious trouble if they break US law. And the key legal provision that's allowed social media platforms really to exist at all, and that's created a legal framework within social media content moderation policies operate, is Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. That law may actually get changed pretty soon. There are both Democrats and Republicans who want it changed, although for very different reasons and in very different ways. But at least at the time that I'm recording this lecture, Section 230 is still the law of the land. By the way, I'll put a video about the history of this act, the Communications Decency Act, down in the description. But basically what Section 230 said was that providers of internet services cannot be held legally responsible for content produced by their users, but they also have a free hand to moderate the content they host as they see fit. This was kind of a weird compromise, basically an acknowledgement of the fact that a lot of the content posted on the internet didn't fit neatly into, as Shirky would put it, kind of the categories of communications media or broadcast media. If we think about many-to-many communications media, about telephones, for example, it totally makes sense that a telephone company, right, a phone service provider, shouldn't be held legally responsible if people use their phone lines to plan a crime or use their phone to slander somebody they're talking to, right? That would be kind of absurd, because the phone company doesn't, and really shouldn't, exercise any control over what people use their phones to say. And we probably wouldn't want a world in which every phone line was tapped and getting monitored for, you know, objectionable content. But if we think about broadcast media, the same legal logic doesn't hold up at all. if a newspaper publishes an article by a writer who libels me or incites violence against me or otherwise, crosses the boundaries of protected free speech to harm me, I can sue the newspaper.
I am going to file a $25 million libel suit against Confidential magazine.
The newspaper, as a publisher, is liable for the content it hosts because it exercises control over what people write on its pages. Since on the internet, ordinary users could post content like pornography, right? And porn actually was the main concern of this 1996 Communications Decency Act. Since users could post content that reached a large public audience in the manner of broadcast media, American lawmakers wanted the hosts of that content, the providers of internet services, to regulate that content, to kind of protect the eyes of innocent children and so on. This was more of a problem for the internet than for phones because, right, you could have call into a phone sex line, but there wasn't much chance of a million children in another country hearing that dirty conversation you're having. But so the problem was that up until that point, the legal precedent from a number of court cases in the US was that when a company did step in to take down content, to take down user-generated content, which in effect meant exercising editorial discretion the way a newspaper does, but the way that a telephone company doesn't, as soon as an internet company started moderating content in this way, they effectively became a publisher. This is according to court cases, according to judges. They became a publisher as soon as they stepped in to moderate content, and so, like a newspaper, they became liable for anything they hosted. So if that had remained the case, that legal precedent had remained the case without a new bill being passed by Congress, it would have been impossible, for example, for Facebook to exist in its current form, right? With well over 1 billion users. Facebook would have to hire, right, just a massive army of moderators to vet every single post before it was published. Otherwise, if somebody libeled me in a post on Facebook, I could actually sue Facebook for damages. So Facebook and social media didn't exist yet in the form we know them, but there were a ton of companies in this market of hosting user-generated content. And so the compromise that the US Congress reached in order to encourage internet companies to moderate objectionable content without making the user-generated content model impossible was that those companies could regulate the user-generated content they hosted without becoming liable for that content, without having the responsibilities of publishers. And I mean, so there are some exceptions that have been established, like child pornography or post-promoting terrorism, that social media platforms do have to take down at least within a reasonable time frame where they can be held liable. But for the most part, these companies get to act like communications media as far as facilitating information transmissions, which they aren't responsible for. But they also get to act like broadcast media as far as exercising editorial discretion over the content they host. So this gives tremendous power to social media platforms, which again didn't exist in anything like their current form back in 1996 when the law was passed. And nobody from Congress foresaw social media platforms becoming so hugely important for the online public sphere. But so the law gives this tremendous power to platforms to moderate as they see fit, to take down content as they choose, and also to leave up content as they choose. And they don't need to really be transparent about what their criteria are for leaving up or taking down content. And those criteria don't have to match up with, the criteria for free speech laid out in U.S. law. Their criteria, also, the social media platforms' criteria for moderation, also don't have to match any kind of criteria for truthfulness, as is usually laid out kind of in the guidelines of broadcast media, right? Publishers and newspapers and TV channels do set criteria for themselves that false content shouldn't be published, but social media platforms do not. And all this power in the hands of platforms of a pretty small number of companies has a lot of people worried, in part because it's undemocratic, right? At least in the US, and I mean, at least in theory, the government is supposed to be a representative democracy, and rules like laws and executive orders for what is acceptable and what is unacceptable speech to introduce to the public sphere gets officially published, right? So there's at least some kind of accountability and transparency, right? Like if a law restricting free speech is unfair, people can go to court to get it removed, or they can vote out the representatives who passed that law, right? They can vote them out of office. But nobody elected Mark Zuckerberg, nobody elected his content moderation team, and they have pretty much a free hand to change their moderation policies however and whenever they see fit, without accountability, without transparency, without oversight. So to get back to my main point, platforms are now important gatekeepers, right? They're important players in the market for loyalties. Social media platforms always end up moderating content, removing the content of some loyalty sellers altogether, or maybe leaving it up but making it more difficult to find, right, by removing that content from search results. So you have to have a direct link to it, a direct URL to connect with it. Platforms always moderate, whether in China, mainly because they're compelled to moderate by the government, or in the US, when where they're mainly compelled to moderate by their own profit motives and by their desire to aggregate the largest possible audience. But they do moderate content. No platform is actually kind of an completely open, or no successful platform is a completely open and free space. And the rules of what's allowed tends to be blurred, right? It gets outlined in these community standards that are often pretty vague and that get applied in very different ways to different users in practice. And it tends to be opaque, in essence, what platforms decide to filter and what they decide to allow through to reach their users. To some extent, this opacity is necessary, and Gillespie, the author of Custodians of the Government, has, I think, more sympathy for the difficult situation of these social media platforms. He has more sympathy than some other critics, and I think that's in part because he himself works for Microsoft. He's a researcher for Microsoft, so he's kind of an insider. And Gillespie points out that if platforms get too clear, too explicit in what their rules are, right? For example, what they consider to be pornography versus art, or versus a representation of something historically important. If they get too clear about where they draw the lines, then inevitably users are going to game the system. They're going to kind of figure out creative ways to avoid being moderated while still publishing horrible content that drives other users out of that online community, and so hurts not only other users, but the platforms themselves. A lot of moderation questions are actually questions of interpretation. This is another problem, right? Is a lot of moderation questions require interpretation of the meaning of content, whether something's a joke or fake news or hate speech or acceptable. And again, as we learned from Stuart Hall, the meaning of a message or an image changes depending on the context and on the decoder of that message. And so it's extremely difficult to program, to train an algorithm to detect objectionable content automatically. It would be expensive for platforms to really hire enough moderators and well enough trained moderators from a diverse enough number of communities to really be exercising this interpretive decoding and exercising editorial judgment of what's acceptable and what isn't. Instead, platforms tend to kind of outsource the job of moderation to poorly paid workers, often on different continents than the users whose content they're moderating. Often moderators have a different, native language than the users publishing the content that they're reviewing. So moderating at this huge scale, the scale at which platforms like Facebook operate, is inherently difficult. It's also, in practice, like impossible to be politically neutral because there's no clear agreed upon boundary, right, between, say, hate speech and political speech. And this is true despite the efforts that social media platforms go to present themselves as neutral, which by the way, as a side note, is not all that dissimilar, I think, from the way from the tremendous efforts that traditional gatekeepers like journalists go to present themselves as neutral and objective, so that people don't look too closely at all the choices that they're making, and at how they're inherently subjective in their judgments. Right now that platforms have become the new gatekeepers, you see kind of an analogous, a similar dance of perform neutrality, I think. But anyway, as difficult as content moderation is, Gillespie does think that platforms could be doing a better job, or a much better job, and that the choices they make of when and how to intervene, in practice, to date, those choices have tended to reinforce inequality. Members of already marginalized groups, for example, members of the LGBT community, tend to face de facto discrimination when it comes to content moderation. And this is true basically in a nutshell because, as I've discussed a bunch of times in various contexts, messages that do not neatly fit into the mainstream, right, the kind of dominant status quo, messages that run contrary to that, as are a lot of messages produced by these marginalized subcommunities, those messages are the ones that tend to get scrutinized the most, that tend to get, questioned the most, and in the social media context tend to get reported as objectionable content unfairly to moderators and get taken down unfairly. And also, of course, by definition, basically, members of these marginalized communities tend to have the least power to do anything about it when content they created gets taken down. And of course, at the same time, members of those groups tend to face the most hate speech and trolling and threats online, which platforms often choose not to moderate. Right? The protections afforded to them by Section 230 means that they're actually not legally obligated to do anything about those problems, about the messages from internet trolls and others that are discouraging people from marginalized group from participating in the online public sphere. And often platforms don't really bother to do so. They don't do a great job of taking down content that's threatening to certain groups of people, that's driving them offline. And this is especially true, when this kind of behavior online is happening in a language that nobody on their content moderation team speaks, in a place, in a country that Silicon Valleys don't know that much about or care that much about, and when it's happening to people who don't have the power to fight back and to shame and to pressure companies the way that governments or even celebrities do when platforms leave up content that governments or celebrities find objectionable.
I'm afraid that Facebook has now turned into a beast, and not what it originally intended. It was used to convey public messages, but we know that the ultra-nationalist Buddhists have their own Facebooks and are really inciting a lot of violence and a lot of hatred against the Rohingya or other ethnic minorities.
And again, hate speech and death threats and rape threats tend to lead people to self-censor, right? To stop producing online content. So the ability of certain groups who are already disadvantaged in the market for loyalties to enter that market as sellers, which is what Clay Shirky, if we remember, was really excited about as a possibility, that potential is really kind of being hamstrung by the ways that the platforms are and are not moderating content. Gillespie goes into a lot more detail and provides some really fascinating case studies in Custodians of the Internet, so I'd recommend you read the whole book. I won't go into detail, but really kind of the overall point is that contrary to Clay Shirky's optimism a decade earlier about the way the rise of social media might create a more level playing field for a greater diversity of media producers and to allow what he called symmetrical participation among all users, Gillespie, I think, paints a picture, a more realistic picture, frankly, and with an extra decade of data. Gillespie paints a picture of continued inequality, albeit with a new set of powerful gatekeepers, the social media platforms themselves. So content moderation is one way in which some information remains retrievable to potential viewers, while other information is made invisible, is essentially unpublished. But another key way in which social media platforms play the role of gatekeeper and kind of as referee in the competition for attention is when it comes to relevance ranking algorithms. This is something that Zeynep Tufekci talks about in her book Twitter and Tear Gas, also from 2018, the same year as Gillespie's book. And Tufekci talks about this especially in the context of social media movements that are trying to attract attention, that are trying to kind of gain a foothold in the market for loyalties. When you log into any social media site, the chances are that the content you see on your homepage or on your newsfeed has been curated by an algorithm. That algorithm surveys all recent posts by your friends, the people that you're following, the posts that include hashtags that you follow, and so on. And the algorithm decides basically what's most relevant for you, which in most cases mean what you're most likely, based on the machine learning that algorithm has been trained on, what you're most likely to engage with for an extended period of time, so that, among other things, so that you have a chance to look at the ads posted on their website, and so that they can collect a few more data points about you that they can then, sell to third parties or use to better target the ads that they show you. So even if a post has not been moderated in the sense of being removed or having a disclaimer placed over it, that post might not be visible to other users if relevance ranking algorithms do not favor it, do not determine that the post should be prominently placed in other users' feeds. And Tufekci, in Twitter and Tear Gas, argues that rather than overt censorship or the actual removal of content from the internet, perhaps the most important way in which social media platforms are shaping the public sphere and the market for loyalties is through their algorithmic allocation of attention. And it's a fascinating book, and especially in Chapter 6, she provides some examples from around the world of social movements that have had a difficult time taking off, even though they were fighting for causes that might enjoy wide popular support. They had difficulty because the messages that they were putting out onto social media were effectively being held back by algorithms that were designed, not to promote social justice or democracy or something like this, but, for example, designed to promote happy content, which users seem to engage with by liking it. And then the last big factor in the competition for attention online that I want to discuss is that still, even in the publish then filter world, vast inequality does remain, despite Shirky's optimism, in the means of mental production, the means of media production. Some actors, some sellers in the market for loyalty, have more resources than others to create online content and to harness the algorithmic allocation of attention and to harness content moderation policies to their own advantage. First off, there's a whole industry that tries to game these algorithms to optimize content for search engines and for relevance rankings, and not everybody can hire a digital marketing firm or employ an in-house SEO team. What's probably even more important, though, is that powerful and often anti-democratic state actors can deploy money and just deploy sheer manpower sometimes to kind of drown out dissent rather than silencing it outright through overt censorship. As Evgeny Morozov writes in his 2011 book, Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, quote, authoritarian governments from Russia to Iran and from China to Azerbaijan are busy turning the internet into the spinternet, a web with little censorship but lots of spin and propaganda, which reinforces their ideological supremacy. Morozov goes on, censors can simply switch to other, less obvious and less intrusive means of minimizing the negative impact of the information being spread online. Instead of censoring it, which in many cases could only confer additional credibility on whatever criticism was expressed in the original blog post or article, the government may choose to go for the spinternet option, counter the blog post with effective propaganda rather than a blanket ban. So although it is technically possible for anyone to publish online, power inequalities still definitely do matter when it comes to what information dominates internet users' attention. Governments have a lot of money and coercive power that they can use, for example, to enlist huge numbers of bureaucrats who work in the public sector to post pro-government messages online and to like particular pro-government messages and downvote dissent messages. Governments can hire or indirectly co-opt young tech-savvy influencers to do their bidding. And actually more and more there are government and allied research and educational organizations that are taking initiatives to train pro-government media producers. Morozov talks about the Kremlin School of Bloggers in his book, for example. And I know that recently the United Arab Emirates has created an official new media academy where they train people to be social media influencers and to produce media that, of course, fits in well with the UAE's ruling ideology and with efforts to brand Dubai and Abu Dhabi as tourist attractions and cultural capital. And in the UAE, you actually need to apply for a license, an influencer's license, if you want to earn money for promoting brands online. So that's one way in which the UAE can keep their influencers, their social media users in line, even without directly employing them by threatening to cut off their online revenue stream by refusing to give them licenses if they don't toe the government line. So there are actually plenty of ways that governments are learning that they can still dominate the market for loyalties. Morozov goes on, quote, governments have learned that they can still manipulate online conversations by slightly adjusting how they manufacture and package their propaganda, with some of their older and otherwise stale messages finding new life and appealing to new audiences. It was hard to predict that xenophobic and anti-American messages would sound more persuasive when delivered by edgy and supposedly independent bloggers. So there's been this shift then in how propaganda gains its legitimacy. If on the demand side, the buyer side of the market for loyalties, the main scarce resource is audience attention, then on the supply side, the seller side, what's become a valuable and scarce resource is no longer the means of reproducing or distributing information, but rather authenticity. That's become the scarce resource, perceived authenticity. What really helps sell a message now, at least to a big segment of the buying audience, is not that the messenger has the impersonal authority of, say, a traditional newspaper that checks its facts and that everybody respects as an august institution because it's been around for 100 years exercising expert, objective judgment. No, what sells a message is that it's coming from the mouth of a real flesh and blood person whom viewers feel they have some connection with and whom they trust as a person. And often kind of as a scrappy upstart against what viewers see as the corrupt stodgy mainstream media. And while authoritarian governments might have lagged behind their democratic opponents in the earliest kind of Web 2.0 days, really up to like the Arab Spring revolutions of 2011 and 2012, in which social media played a big role in organizing protests, those governments are now catching up. They're figuring out ways to control not just traditional mainstream broadcast media, but also this new online public sphere. So that's the big picture. In the next part of this lecture, I'm going to talk about how professional journalists are adapting to this new world, and I should be able to offer some glimmers of hope about prospects for truth-telling, and also a bit of parting advice about how media producers, consumers, and even platforms might all pitch in for the health of the public sphere.